Hello, everyone. Welcome to this interview with Professor Tanweer Fazal. He is a professor of sociology at the University of Hyderabad. Before this, he taught at the Center for the Study of Social Systems, CSSS, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Amongst his publications includes the books, The Nation State and Minority Rights, Comparative Perspectives on Muslim and Sikh Identities, London, Routledge, 2014, Minority Nationalisms in South Asia, edited London and Delhi, Routledge, 2012, and The Minority Conundrum, Living in Majoritarian Times, edited Delhi, Penguin Random House. Welcome, sir. We thank you for your generous time and being available in such a crisis time as well. So we welcome you to this conversation with Doing Sociology.
Thank you, the Doing Sociology team. You're doing a tremendous job. And thank you very much for having me over.
Right. So, just to start off, you have written a lot on the minority question and nationalism in India. And your recent book, The Minority Conundrum, how do you see tying into this particular, idea, interest and idea and, add to the general discourse? If you could sort of begin the conversation by answering that general question.
Yeah, see, the whole question about minority today has taken a completely different turn. The time when I started working on minority, we were discussing minority rights. And that was a time when we were talking about how the question about minority rights have been, arrived at in Indian context. What are the conceptual and definitional, context and trajectory, and we would try seeing that what are the limitations within it. So I tried to look at the minority rights question from the first, trying to understand what constitutes a minority. And this was in relationship with the idea of nation state. So as the idea of a nation state, of a homogeneous cultural community constituting a state, this idea, as it starts gaining currency, a parallel process which it unleashes is the process of minoritization, whereby communities which earlier did not see themselves as outside or stigmatized or targeted, uh, but they begin seeing themselves as, because they are now seen as outside the national mainstream. See, in India, you will see that how minoritization has taken place, for instance, of the Sikhs. The Sikhs at one point of time were seen as integral to the Indian national idea. But over the years, through a process of Punjabi Suba movement, the 1984 crisis, which we all know, and then we see how assertively the Sikhs started seeing themselves as minoritized, as those who were considered as, they saw themselves as targeted communities, and they were targeted at one point of time, targeted by majoritarian violence, uh, although it has subsided to that to certain extent in the physical form, but that kind of a minoritization in various different forms continues. So that is one example which I was trying to give. So that was the thing which we were looking at that point of time. And then we try to see what is the nature of the discourse of rights, both in terms of the theories and concepts around that, which have developed within the domain of social sciences. Sociology had not too much of a contribution to make in that, particularly Indian sociology. And however, as you know, political sociology is my interest, and political sociology is, to a certain extent also uh, goes into what is otherwise considered as a domain reserved for political science. So these are borrowed ideas, and we develop these ideas, in a continuous kind of a dialogue with parallel disciplines, such as political science, as I said. So the question of minorities, when I started examining it, I had to look into the Constituent Assembly debates. I had to go before that to the 1906 Shimla delegation, the 1919 Government of India Act, the 1935 Government of India Act, and a whole history of it. Today, the minority question has taken a completely different turn altogether, in the sense that Today, it is a question of security primarily. It is no longer just a question of rights, whereby I mean that the Constitution of India ultimately, through its Article 29 and 30, guaranteed minority rights. These were largely cultural rights. The right for every minority community to establish educational institutions of its own so as to preserve its culture. It was assumed that minority groups need protection and they fear the erasure of their own cultural identity, and therefore they should be allowed to have their own institutions which could preserve those cultural practices which are in various different forms. But then today is a question about primarily security. Let us say there is increasingly, as there is a rise of triumphalist nationalism, a supremacist thought, and it entering state, uh, institutions in a big way. Today, it is more of a question of a security, the entire minority question. And that is why the minority conundrum, when it came out very recently last year in 2020, it is a collection of essays written by people from different walks of life, academics as well as civil society activists, journalists, uh, and others. Now here we actually examine, uh, as I said, the whole entire minority question largely in the context of the enormity of violence now today, which is there pervasive in society, and particularly against certain minority groups.
Uh, Sir, so, because we're talking about minority rights, so the question of the state becomes extremely important, and you have been studying the Indian state for some time now. So, could you comment on how the idea and practice of secularism have changed over the years in India since independence and up till now?
Yeah, that is very interesting because it is true that while all through our national movement, the visualization of a post-independent Indian state was of a secular state. And this is how the Congress also fashioned itself, related itself to the minority question, as well as the promise to others citizenry within the country. So, but when it came to actually, inserting the word secularism into the preamble, there was huge debate. The debate was largely brought in from the, what you could say, quote unquote, the Congress right, which argued that by establishing a secular state, there was an insidious process of overlooking or sidestepping the great Indian ancient culture, whereby they meant the Hindu culture. The other fear was that the state would, in this sense, would discourage spiritual education, and there, and this is what they wanted the citizens to be, to be those who also had a spiritual bend of mind, apart from being, concrete, tangible, material concerns which they had. Uh, Largely, it was uh, a debate. This debate was also in the context of the partition which had taken place. And they felt that a secular state was too much of a concession to the minorities who had already got, particularly Muslims, who had already got Pakistan. And therefore, they didn't need any further concession. The word secularism actually got inserted during the period of emergency. And this was when also a period, if you recall, that this is from the late 1960s onwards. There is a gradual, in the polity itself, gradual rise of majoritarian tendencies. The 1969 or 67 elections saw the defeat of the Congress in many states, and the rise of the Hindu right politically. Probably that was one of the reasons why it was felt that secularism now needed to be inserted as a preamble of the constitution, along with socialism as well. The trajectory which the Indian state has covered on the question of secularism is interesting. India, although, you know, if you recall the incidents of the building of the Somnath temple, which involved K.M. Munshi, the agriculture minister in uh, Prime Minister Nehru's cabinet, as well as the Home Minister, Mr. Patel. Now, Pandit Nehru definitely had objections towards it, for he believed that the state and its officials should have nothing to do with religion. That was the idea of secularism which he had. But the others had a different view. When President Rajendra Prasad was requested by Pandit Nehru not to participate in the inauguration of Somnath Temple, being the president, he responded that he would participate in the inauguration of any other religious, worship, place of worship as well. This just suggested that the debate on the question of secularism was alive in India. There was no finality. One view which was the Nehruvian secular modernist view, which argues that the state and the religion, there has to be a wall of separation. A wall of separation wherein the state is to do with matters of secular temporal activities, whereas the sacred should be confined to the private domain. That has been one view which has been pursued, but not thoroughly. A second view, of course, has been that the state, if it is secular, it only means that it doesn't have to stay away from religion, but it should only be treating every religion equally. And now this is the two different kind of view which has existed on the question of secularism in India. However, over the years now, what we see is that it has taken a new turn. The new turn came with this entire, you know, uh, what you would say, the bonhomie around, the entire uh, hue and cry about pseudo secularism. This was a coinage of the right wing in India, that the secular state was pseudo secular. It was pseudo secular because it was more protective towards the minorities and ignored the majority. Along with the idea of pseudo secularism, another term which was popularized was appeasement, minority appeasement. Both the usage of both the term actually was to target the idea of the state which saw itself as distinct and separate from religion. Now, this increasingly has this latter view now increasingly has gained more currency in India. We see increasingly that a large majority of the population, particularly of the middle classes, uh, tend to accept that the state has faltered in you know in offering its protective umbrella towards the minority groups, that it has actually been a vote bank politics, that is many of the people would believe and argue. But at the same time, it should not be forgotten that equality is not necessarily uniformity. The idea of equality means that those who are unequal, those who are left behind, need extra protection to be able to be equal. Uh, the view that argues that there shouldn't be any targeted development of groups and communities, etc., who have been left behind, that view assumes that what is that view would hold that everyone that there should be a uniformity in every kind of policies and programs. But that is not a correct practice of equality. It might actually lead to you know enhancing inequality. For example, if in a say uh, uh, in any situation, say in a classroom, we are all teachers. In a classroom, there are students who have, for reasons, variety of reasons, the classroom is generally very diverse, and for a variety of reasons may not have the same capacity to cope up with the you know advanced literature. They need a extra sort of a help or support. This is not necessarily appeasement. This is simply a practice of equality to ensure that equality is attained. That is exactly what the state, when it s- started pushing for targeted development, it was not simply for the minorities. In fact, it came for the minorities very late. Only after such a committee that do we see, which was in 2006, that we see that the state had moved from culturalism from culturalism to certain kind of material development for the minorities. But the targeted development for other disadvantaged sections of the society, such as the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes, the backward classes, has had a longer history. And so one would say that equality and uniformity should not be confused. Equality demands that those who are unequal should get certain kind of a proportionately greater share, so that or greater attention, not share necessarily, but greater attention, so that they also uh, come at par with others.
Right. So my next question to you is that you've written how minorityism is a myopic way of profiling communities. So could you elaborate on this, and what are some of the important juridical debates around religious minorities and reservations in India? If you could speak on this.
uh, Largely, as of now, there is no provision of reservation for the religious minorities. Alright. Although sections of religious minorities are beneficiaries of reservation. For example, a good proportion of the Muslims are included amongst the OBCs, but there is no as such a separate kind of a reservation for the Muslims. However, in state governments, particularly some of the southern Indian state governments, have had a different practice. In Kerala, particularly, we see that it's an entire Muslim population, for example, minus the creamy layer, is included amongst the OBCs. So that is one thing. Largely, we do not have a reservation for the or quotas for the minorities, religious minorities, whether in educational admissions or in public employment. This, of course, in the past was a different practice. Uh, Prior to independence, we are aware that in the Government of India Acts, there was provision for guaranteed representation, particularly in the domain of politics, to minority groups. At that particular point of time, the minority was a larger kind of a category, which included not only the religious or linguistic minorities. I'm talking about a period prior to independence, not only religious and linguistic minorities, but it also included the depressed classes, the tribes, and others. Uh, however, uh, as the new constitution came into existence, the provision of guaranteed representation, as well as assurance for share in public employment for religious minorities, was dropped. One of the reasons probably was the context of partition and the interreligious violence which we faced. As a result, religion itself came to be seen as a suspect category. Now, you refer to the to minorityism. Minorityism again is a term which has been used frequently, but in my one of the essays which I wrote, I tried to distinguish minorityism from minority rights. Minorityism, I argue, is when a community is reduced to just a cultural being, that it is seen as a bearer of culture and is you know uh, some ways boxed into sort of an identity question altogether, whereas its material deprivations which it faces gets ignored. Why I say this is, look at, for example, article 29 and 30, which we referred to earlier. It only talks about the protection of cultures of minority groups. But we also know that minority groups, on account of their identity, have also faced stigma, prejudice, as well as violence, which we have witnessed to now. And hence, uh, 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 they suffer material deprivation too. How do we address that question? Minoritism of state practice, and in this, the cultural state, the secular state too was actively involved. That minoritism in state practice would mean that the state, you know, uh, ignores the fact that minority groups too are, not homogeneous, that there are layers and layers within them, that there are power differentials which exist within minority groups too, that there are different status groups, hierarchies, etc., which exist. It simply treats them as a monolith. It treats them as a monolith as it speaks to them through certain cultural interlocutors. You see, the religious leaders, etc., become cultural interlocutors through which the secular state would speak to its own minorities, rather than directly, you know, introducing the idea of citizenship uh, through addressing their material concerns. So that is what I would argue that minoritism is all about. Minority rights, on the other, is a more expansive idea, which doesn't reduce itself just to according certain kind of a recognition to the identity, but it would also mean that the state sees the community as well as the members of the community as active citizens, and then uh, lends a certain kind of helping hand towards those who are deprived.
Right. So when you talk about all of these, and you called yourself a political sociologist, do you feel that enough has been studied in India in the context of elections and political processes, or do you think that a lot can be done on this issues?
No, this question too. You're right. Elections. India is one of the countries, such a large democracy, which has successfully, regularly organizing elections. And elections are big events in which it involves massive campaigns, uh, various kinds of political debates, etc., take place. It is at the times of elections, but somehow or the other, for elections has not been has not received much attention from the sociologists. uh, I would not say that it has not been studied at all. There have been some attempts, such as F.G. Bailey's early work in the 1950s on Orissa election, or I think A.M. Shah and his team uh, studied the late 1960s assembly elections. And the book has now recently come out. But these are very few attempts to actually study the elections. What could be the reason? One of the reasons I believe is that because sociologists are more interested in processes which are long term, elections are seen as simply as events. For sociologists, then, uh, even political sociologists, politics is about power, and which is not simply reduced to its formal institutions, such as the government, elections, etc., or political party. Power, the distribution of power in society, the relationship between the dominant and the subordinate, these are have been more the concern of the sociologists rather than elections. But I have come to argue that elections are also an event in which great negotiations, new alliances, and etc. take place within the social domain. This should not be, the sociologist shouldn't miss that. Uh, it is important to study elections because elections are period in which political consciousness, political debates, contestations, uh, as I said, also various new kinds of social alliances, new negotiations of power take place. And sociologists should take note of them. And however, when the sociologist studies election, it doesn't reduce elections to psephology. When the sociologist studies election, he should be aware of the history, should be able to capture, you know, the social profile of the place in which the elections are held, should be able to, you know, capture also the different kinds of interest groups and the relations which they have amongst them. The relationship, as I mentioned, of domination, of subordination, etc., patterns of it, all should be, taken note of to produce a comprehensive sociological analysis of elections and the political process.
Right. Our final question to you is, that given your recent interest, could you tell us how sociology approaches the questions of collective violence and questions of justice? And then what kind of methodological tools and caveats will you advise for researchers who are studying volatile situations such as which
Yeah,
concern these? So if you could tell us that.
yeah, yeah. That's also very interesting as well as very intriguing too. That despite violence being so endemic, collective violence, yet uh, at least I can speak on behalf of the sociologists. It has been an ignored area in the Indian sociology. Now, what could be the reasons? Uh, I'm not sure why, but probably one of the reasons is that sociologists avoid volatile situations. They look for stable structures. So, therefore, they would study village society. They would study castes as a system. You know, they will study agrarian class formations. Uh, these are more stable long-term, projects, whereas violence or collective violence is so volatile. Situations keep changing time and again, and for a sociologist, it is rather, you know, to avoid than to enter into it. That could be one reason, I believe. Uh, Now, but as I noticed, that these are extremely pertinent questions, which increasingly have come to inform our everyday life too. The anthropologist who studies the everyday life again sees this everyday life in terms of, cultural patterns, kinship systems, uh, seasonal cycles of agricultural production or things like that. But violence is so much, constitutive of the everyday life. You cannot even imagine everyday life without. It is not so idyllic. It is not, you will find violence of various different kinds, you know, uh, very much inherent. Galtung talks about structural violence, which is the violence which is systemic, which may not be spectacular, which is not physical violence, but which is far more pervasive, and that is again the structural violence is very much imminent, very much present. So, therefore, I see that this is one of the important things that phenomena which needs closer sociological scrutiny. However, it is because it is volatile, and because violence is also very deeply political. Sociologists or social scientists need to be very careful while studying, such situations. Uh, Methodological tools could be many. Rather, I would advise the combination of different methodological approaches. You might need statistics as much as you need historical method. So going back into the history, using archives, visiting them, using documents, at the same time the narratives. You know, it becomes extremely important then to be able to see and understand. And sociology should then not avoid questions such as who were the perpetrators, who were the killers, who were the victims, what was the reason, what was the context, whether justice was delivered, whether justice, how are do people see the question of justice itself as. There was at one point of time pushed by the NGOs the idea of restorative justice. Restorative justice would mean that it is a form of justice in which people do not necessarily look towards punitive actions against the perpetrators, but some way or the other, the perpetrators and the victims come to live with each other, forgetting the past. The whole idea was about the focus was through again civil society and NGO driven idea about reconciliation. But Professor Dipankar Gupta studied one of the rare sociologists who studied violence. He actually studied post-violence rehabilitation and reconciliation in Gujarat. That there is no proper reconciliation without justice. The question of justice for the victims becomes extremely important. Uh, Rituparna, I believe you come from Assam,
Yes, sir. Yeah, yeah.
and you see Assam witnessed some of the biggest violence, ethnic clashes, etc. And again, it has been an understudied subject. The Nelly massacre was not even reported in most of the national dailies, and even the provincial media also ignored it, probably consciously. Uh, but one of the persons who has studied is a Japanese scholar from CSSS itself. Uh, but that was an attempt made in late in the 90s. The violence itself took place in 1983. There are various explanations, and as the scholar interviewed people who were considered to be perpetrators or victims, various kinds of uh, things which had come to be associated with Nelly massacre now were unraveled. You know, it was no longer, for example, the Tiwas, who were the tribals, were always. It was argued that, and many of the well-known commentators on Assam would say that the Tiwas took to violence against this immigrant Bengali-speaking Muslims because the Tiwas were angry with them, as their land has been encroached. And this was the widely held belief in Assam as well as the rest of India. But as the scholar found, that the Tiwas, strongly refuted it, saying that no, it they had nothing to do with land dispute. It was basically, you know, the Assam movement, its anti-foreigner, political mobilization that pushed Tiwas towards violence against the immigrant Muslims. Violence is also a moment, collective violence is also a moment in which you reassert your identity or try to reconfigure it. The Tiwas wanted to become part of the Assamese nationality, and that violence is a moment through which they can assert it. Uh, this can be seen as one dimension of collective violence in various different instances. I just gave you example of the Nelly massacre. So therefore, I believe that violence is that this is important an area to study, has great sociological implications, and despite the problems within, the researcher should not avoid it.
All right. Thank you so much, sir, for taking time out to do this interview. You have thrown light on some of the things that we have not had a chance to discuss till now, like the relationship between minorities, minority rights, and the state, as well as how to move towards the sociological understanding of violence and minorities, and what upcoming political sociologists can take from this. Thank you so much, sir. We had also done an interview with Rudolf Heresia on collective violence and memory. And I hope our audience can actually connect these two and sort of, arrive at understanding these things sociologically, which is very much the need of the hour, but yet understudied.
Thank you very much. And now if you stop the recording.